We're going outside the book, live to you from the Carol Knicely Center on the South Campus of Western Kentucky University. I'm Barbara Deeb here at the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books 2011, and we are very pleased to talk this morning with the headliner, Nicholas Sparks. Do you like to go by Nick or Nicholas?
Nicholas,
Okay.
really. I mean, when I'm in public, people call me everything from hey you to my wife might call me hun, or I know I'm in trouble when she calls me Nicholas, but usually
Okay.
out in public it's Nicholas.
Well, you're not in trouble, Nicholas,
Yes.
but let's talk a little bit about you. You know, reading your bio, it doesn't seem to me that you set out to be a writer. And so how'd that all happen?
I didn't. I never grew up thinking I was going to be a writer, but I don't think that makes me atypical. I really think that makes me probably more typical, especially as at least if you're looking at bestseller lists for whatever they're worth. I mean, John Grisham started out, he was a lawyer. David Baldacci was a lawyer. Pat Conroy was an English teacher. Danielle Steele sold. She was in public relations. Mary Higgins Clark was a homemaker. So I think the key, I guess, distinguishing characteristic of all of us and most of the people who do that is just a strong desire hits them at one point in time to eventually tell a story, and then they go through their own learning process to get there, whether it's they go to law school but no matter what, every one of them actually sat down and said, okay, I'm actually going to put some words on the page.
And I'm going to tell a story.
And I'm going to tell a story.
And your stories are very romantic, very poignant, very touching, and they really have touched, as you probably could tell better than anybody, such a wide array of people, of readers. So let's break that down, if you will, because, I mean, first of all, romance, what is that?
Romance in literature is a very specific genre, one that, ironically, I actually do not work in. I don't write romance novels, really. They're more, I don't know what they are. You could call them love stories, you could call them dramatic fiction, but they wouldn't even be accepted as a romance novel because those tend to have a very specific structure that you have to follow and very specific themes, none of which I do. These are stories that really are meant to move the reader through the entire range of human emotion. That's what I write, and that's what most dramatic fiction or dramatic theater or dramatic film, that's really what they're attempting to do, is to move you through the entire range of human emotion, of which love is part of that, sadness is part of that, anger, happiness, joy. And if you can do all those things well, I think it tends to resonate with the audience, whatever that is. And really, that's what I set out to do.
So not just one emotion, not just move them in one direction, you're giving them the whole gamut.
And that's the big difference. In a romance novel, that's not a requirement. You're really supposed to evoke the feeling of a romantic fantasy. In this genre, no. I mean, it's pretty much all of the emotions of life. And it's a very effective little genre, you might say, or a very effective medium, whether it's in film or theater, because if you do that just right, the audience, whether again it's a reader or someone in the seats, by feeling as if they've experienced all the emotions of life, they really feel as if they've lived a mini life by the time they finish. And that's why it tends to resonate. That's why people remember The Notebook for such a long time, or they remember A Walk to Remember for such a long time. It's because it made them, they lived an entire life with these two characters. And that's an important distinction between my genre and what other genres do. You know, thrillers are really supposed to thrill. A horror novel is really supposed to scare you. They don't have to move you through every emotion, but that is just the function of the genre I work in.
Well, that having been said, that sounds like it's more taxing on the writer because you've got to set out to do just that.
It is. I think it is. I mean, it's funny, when I talk to other best-selling authors, and really we don't hang out in a club or anything. This is
Oh,
I probably see them as much as anyone here at the book festival, to be quite frank, maybe once every 2 or 3 years. And they'll say things, boy, I just love writing. I'm like, are you crazy? I find writing incredibly challenging. But then that could also just be that, they're better at it or they're more natural. I don't know. I mean, I find the whole thing very hard because you do have to do it just right. You have to evoke the emotion with you have to evoke genuine emotion as opposed to manipulating it. You have to be dramatic without being melodramatic. you have to be universal without being cliched.
Yes,
All of those things to really do
lessons.
it well and make it resonate for an extended period of time.
Well, talk about resonate for an extended period of time, the longevity of your work, and then taking it into the dramatic arena. So many movies have been made from your books. Talk a little bit about that, because I think, when I told people that you were coming and we were going to be talking to you, that's what they said. Does he now write then with the fact in mind that this may become a movie?
In the end, I'm always a novelist, and that's really important because you don't know Hollywood. There was a couple of novels that I knew would sell for film. I knew The Guardian would, for instance, and I knew The Choice would. They didn't. The one that I knew wouldn't, Nights in Rodanthe, did sell, and not only that, it actually got made and did very well. So I have been around long enough to know that you can't predict Hollywood. So really, I set out to write the best novel that I can, and then I've been very fortunate with regard to Hollywood.
Share with our viewers what it was like when you got the phone call that your book was being optioned and it had been accepted and they were going to make a movie. Do you remember what that feeling was like?
Yeah, it was a few days after I had sold the novel, and it just came out of the blue, and I remember thinking very distinctly that, this is a very odd life that I'm leading now. All of a sudden, these things are happening. But at the same time, you have to realize that first novel was The Notebook. That was in 2000. I'm sorry, I sold that for film in 1995. That film didn't start filming until 2003.
Wow.
And so there was this really long time. And I'll tell you, that whole journey is the novel in and of itself. You're going to do this, and this screenwriter, and he does that, and they don't know what to do, and they sit on it, and Steven Spielberg thinks about he's going to do something with it, so it sits on the shelves for a year while they wait. Crazy stuff. But it was exciting. I think the more exciting film was the second one. It was the first film, Message in a Bottle, because that went into production just so fast. I sold it when I wasn't even done with the novel. I was only halfway done. I had an outline for the rest. Warner Brothers bought it, and by the time I finished the novel, they're already done with the first screenplay.
Wow.
And I'm like, now that's fast.
Well, but then when you saw it, sitting there in the screening room or whatever, what kind of emotion did that evoke?
The first time is a bit of disbelief. You see names. It's like, wow, I picked the name Teresa and Garrett. That's so neat. Wow, happenstance. I picked that name. So you go and you feel these little bits of excitement, and then you just settle in and watch the film and evaluate the film on its merits. And I will be honest, it's a little different now since I've done it so many times. It's still exciting, but your first time, it's always something you'll remember forever.
Is that a problem now, though, that you're at that place in your career, in your life? You're out there. So are you still being genuine to what you set out to be genuine to?
As far as the quality of the work,
writing?
yeah, of course. That's the nature of my personality, though. It's just more the nature of my personality. People say, do you have deadlines? I say yes, and this is true, but my publisher isn't going to fire me. I know this. I do know this.
Job security?
Yeah, I do. So why do I because it really is me and what I'm trying to do. And really, I sit down and try to write the best novel that I can with every novel that I write. And while all authors will tell you this is not true. Because you don't have to once you reach my level. You can just begin to write the same book pretty much over and over. But really, I try to vary everything in my novels every time. And so there's always a challenge there. And I'm just the kind of person who really loves a challenge. And that's it. It's just the nature of my personality.
You talk about the challenge, but you also said it's a bit challenging that you're not crazy about writing per se, the process.
Yeah.
So take us through, we've got just a couple minutes remaining, your day-to-day. Do you force yourself to sit down and write for X number of hours?
Most days when I'm writing a novel might take 4 or 5 months, and let's say that I write 2,000 words a day. And so and it'll take me, let's say, 140,000 words writing to get the 90,000 that I keep. So 140,000 divided by 2,000 is 70 days, and that would be in a 4-month period. So out of about 120 to 150 days, I'm writing 70 of them. And then the other days, I'm thinking endlessly about them. And so, it might be, I usually write midday, 10 to 2 or so. 2,000 words, it might take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. Sometimes it takes up to 8. I edit as I go through the process the whole time.
Good to know. And 2012, Lucky One comes out in a movie?
2012, The Lucky One comes out. Safe Haven starts filming this year. Many more films. So it's good. I mean, like I said, I've been very fortunate.
And you've been very kind to share your time with us. We've been talking with author Nicholas Sparks, coming to you from the 2011 Southern Kentucky Festival of Books. The recipient of the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for Biography, T.J. Stiles, joins us now from the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books. I'm Barbara Deeb, and we're very delighted to have you with us. Especially as we celebrate the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, you do a lot of writing about that time period. And what do you feel like we learn by studying that, and why the popularity of your books? It must touch something within the reader.
Well, I think the Civil War era, the Civil War, Reconstruction, expansion into the West, this is really the making of the modern United States. This is, I just heard David Blight refer to it, the great historian, as the founding of the Second Republic. The United States remakes itself in the Civil War era. And I think it's a time that's not only critical for the history of the nation, but the lives that people lived within that period are remarkable. The transformations they went through, the suffering they went through, the triumphs they achieved, and it's a fascinating period to explore. And in terms of writing biography, it's an amazing period to focus on, in following life stories.
As you look at, you talk about a remaking. Do you feel like that's cyclical as well, in that every population has to go through some type of remaking or rehash at certain cycles in time?
I'm not sure I'm equipped to draw vast conclusions for human civilizations overall. I know that in the United States, we've had these conflicts that have led us to develop and expand our values, to address problems, deep-seated problems we've had. The Civil War, of course, addressing those problems cost the lives of about 2% of the population. So it was, a horrible period, and yet it led to emancipation. It led to writing racial equality into the Constitution, though it took some time before it became a reality. I mean, the results are simply astounding. And of course, as I focus on in my new book, it was a time when the corporate economy began to take off, when industrialization happened, and there are terrible conflicts that surround that, which makes it fascinating and also terribly important for today.
Let's talk a little bit about the research that you do, because you have been lauded for your authenticity. You really do your homework and you really get the facts straight, the critics say.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you broach a subject? Is it something that comes in your head and you say, I'm going to write a book about this, and then you start the research? How does that work?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I've been focusing on iconic lives, people who have sort of larger-than-life stature in the American memory. And they become iconic, of course, because they represent something to Americans about how they think of themselves. Jesse James has had a certain cultural meaning. He represents something about the way we think of the United States. Cornelius Vanderbilt and all of the so-called robber barons, they have more than one meaning, sometimes conflicting meanings, but they represent something about how we think about our society. And so addressing them as real people, getting at who they were in reality, getting past all of the sort of cultural baggage they carry, and yet it is very important. That's central to my work. And yet I pick them because they are iconic, because they have this larger cultural meaning. And the tension between the two, what we think we know and what they really were, is a really fascinating part of the process.
In your research for the Tycoon book, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, what did you learn about him that surprised you?
Well, one thing was that he's been, personally and sort of historically, I could answer it two ways. One is that he's been represented as this really harsh man within his family, just like many business figures, driven, cold, hard on his family, unpleasant personally. And I found that there's a basis in truth for that. I mean, the facts do show that he was often tough on his family, a very hard man often to deal with, and yet I found evidence that in fact he was someone who had warmth, compassion, who had a softer side as well, who often didn't know how to deal with his emotional life. In other words, he was complex. He was an identifiable human being that we can recognize and understand, even if we don't always want to have been around him. Historically, what surprised me is that early in his life, he was a radical force. Before there were big businesses in America, you had an older families that sort of ran the country, the old landed elite from the colonial days, and entrepreneurs, people who insisted upon competition, were actually praised by Jacksonian Democrats as these are the egalitarians, these are the individualists. They're overturning the established order of things. And Vanderbilt kept those values and his views all through his life, but he helped to create big business in America. And once you had giant corporations, a sort of laissez-faire attitude became a conservative attitude. And following that process is fascinating. You know, I don't try to use Cornelius Vanderbilt to pitch any views about the modern economy, but I look at the way people argued about him at the time. And it's fascinating. It resonates to today.
Well, talk about today a little bit, because you talk about writing about iconic figures. If you had the opportunity to write about an iconic figure in present day, who would that be? Do you know?
Oh, that's that's a difficult question. I mean, you know, at some point I may move into the 20th or even 21st century, and I've thought, you know, how would I handle it? It's difficult. One of the things I try to do in my books is, with each book, I try to find someone I can do something different from the previous book.
How do you mean that?
Well, for example, Jesse James was a life that was filled with violence, military conflict. It had to do with the Civil War and its consequences. And so I thought, I want to write a book about business, an area that a lot of historians have difficulty with, actually, but the rise of a business empire, and I could get further into his family life, for example. My next book covers the same period, but again, I'm picking somebody I can do something different with. It's a book about George Armstrong Custer. Now, he's had plenty of writing about him, but I want to change the camera angle, write about his life in terms of the chronological frontier of the Civil War era that we've been talking about, rather than just the geographical frontier. And again, he and his wife wrote enormous numbers of letters, and I can get deeper into his personal life, look at their relationship in the context of these times. Again, I'm addressing the same period, but I'm going a little farther, doing something a little different from the previous book.
But you're the gatekeeper. You're the one who filters the information that comes through. So you could shine the spotlight or the lens in a different way. And so that puts a big responsibility on you, I guess, to display that, to be genuine.
I think that's true, and you know, the responsibility differs according to the subject. With Cornelius Vanderbilt, with Jesse James, for example, there's been a lot of good research that's been done about his individual crimes, about different particular aspects of his life. My mission was to tell that dramatic story, but to put it in the context of the times in a way that hadn't been done, I thought, before. With Cornelius Vanderbilt, I was looking at someone who's never had a serious biography. So I really had a responsibility to try to cover it comprehensively. With George Custer, on the other hand, George Armstrong Custer, here's someone who's had a lot of good writing about him, comprehensively, individual events. So I can sort of take a more interpretive look. I don't have that sense that I must provide the definitive account, because I respect the writing that's been done about him. I just want to do something a little bit different. And so it's kind of less of a burden to provide the definitive account.
And just for our viewers, do you write every day? Do you make yourself sit down and I'm going to write for X number of hours? How does it work?
No, it's a little different with a research-intensive nonfiction than it is for fiction, I think. I spend, with any given book, the bulk of my time is spent in researching. I mean, that takes longer than the writing. And then also there's interpretation. You know, what does this mean? What's going on? Having to go back and read what historians have said. And then the writing, I never have to force myself to write. My problem is that I spend so much time rewriting what I've written before, it's hard to move along. And that's an essential process too.
And yet to accomplish, what's ahead?
I'm going to be working on I've already been working on my book about George Armstrong Custer. I just spent the last week, for example, working in the National Archives. My eyes are weak from looking at so much microfilm, thousands of pages of microfilm.
But it apparently pays off.
Letter books, yes.
Yes.
It's I feel like you can't. For me, I can't farm out the research. Occasionally, I can ask people to send me copies of things, but the bulk of the research, I have to look at it because it will spark ideas. It will take me in new directions to actually go through everything myself.
TJ Stiles, continued success.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. From the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books, TJ Stiles. Outside the Book continues. Albert Schmid joins us now. He's a master chef, and his most recent book is the Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook, an appropriate cookbook from the state of Kentucky, from the Commonwealth. Thanks for being here, Albert.
Oh, hey, my pleasure.
How does one broach? I mean, you're in territory. That's like talking basketball in the state of Kentucky. We talk about their bourbon. You're talking.
It is, and everybody seems to have their own favorite bourbon or distillery. And the other thing that I've noticed about being in Kentucky is that the master distillers are very accessible, and everybody has a story about a master distiller. So
how'd you broach this? I mean, when you're going in, okay, I'm going to write this cookbook. It's going to be about bourbon. Where do you begin?
Well, the whole idea started down in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was actually at the Dickie Brennan Bourbon House, which is on Bourbon Street, and I grew up in New Orleans. And there was this was in 2008. A master distiller was doing a dinner, and it was a sort of a bourbon pairing, and I walked out of the dinner wondering how chefs were using bourbon in cooking, and because there was so much bourbon that night, both in the food and then pairing it, that I wondered, and so I started asking questions.
What is it about bourbon that adds and or detracts or contributes to a meal or to cooking?
Well, I've found that bourbon only adds to a meal. I mean, it enhances things. Alcohol by its very nature is a flavor enhancer, so it enhances the flavor of food anyway. But then bourbon adds special notes, butterscotch, cinnamon, absolutely wonderful flavors, and it only enhances the food. So
it's a good thing.
It is.
Do you have a favorite? Can you even say that?
Oh, a favorite recipe? I have several favorite recipes for different reasons. Let's see. One I sort of came up with. I figured since bourbon's sort of a southern part of Southern cuisine.
Sure, and culture.
Exactly. I needed to have a biscuit. And so what I did was what I call the angel share biscuit. And for distillers, the angel share is the part of the whiskey that disappears in the warehouse.
Okay.
So they put the barrels up for a while, and there's evaporation of bourbon. Well, when you add bourbon to biscuits and then put them in the oven, the bourbon evaporates because of the heat.
Okay.
And so there's the flavor's left behind, but none of the alcohol is.
Huh.
So that was kind of one of my favorites. But I also, the French toast is absolutely fantastic.
Doesn't that sound wonderful? French toast made with bourbon?
Right.
Oh my.
Bourbon French
And again,
toast.
so those who are shrieking, who maybe don't imbibe, are saying, but you're saying that the bourbon burns off, it's not going to the alcohol.
Most of the time, there are a few recipes in here where the bourbon's going to stay behind, but for the most part, most of the alcohol is going to burn away.
Now, you're a master chef, so you have to test out these recipes, right? Okay, which is probably fun. But how do you at what point do you say, okay, we got it, we're there?
Well, some of the recipes came from friends, and so what I did was try to represent their recipes as best I could, and tried to stay true to their recipe and their vision. But then some of the others where I developed and sort of tested in the kitchen, I tested all of the recipes, even the ones from the friends, and tweaked them a little bit. But once it tastes good, you just don't mess with it.
But that's your taste buds.
Correct.
Yes. So how do we the consensus?
I have a family, so my wife, who's very, very picky, tasted them, and then also my sons, the ones that I felt were appropriate. They tasted too, and they were real honest. They would say, ooh, yuck, or they would say, ooh, this is a good one. But the flavor of bourbon is so fantastic that really there were very few that we rejected.
Didn't hit the mark.
Correct.
As a master chef, is that something that chefs aspire to in general, is to eventually one day I'm going to have a cookbook?
Well, I think all chefs would like to think that they could produce a cookbook at some point, and a lot of times it's sort of representative of what you've done in your past or how you're influenced. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and sort of moved around the country, and so I pick up a little thing, various things throughout the country. And the latest influence, the last 12 years, has been the bourbon. So.
Well, and I think with all the proliferation of the Food Network and those kinds of things, people really, even though they didn't know they've become foodies, and they really enjoy now cooking. So that's helped what you do, I suspect.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, I teach at a university, and we have tons of students, and they're all, the Food Network is probably their biggest influence. So they see Giada De Laurentiis and Rachel Ray and Alton Brown, and they want to be those people. So
new appreciation for food. What do you have left? What's the next one going to be? From bourbon to?
Well, I'm actually working on 2 projects. One's going to be on Kentucky cuisine, and the other one is going to be on cocktails. So I'm going where I did cocktails and a little bit of Kentucky cuisine. I'm sort of going in 2 different directions.
Do you have a favorite cocktail?
Oh gosh, I absolutely love the Old Fashioned, which is made with bourbon, and I also love the Manhattan. And the Sealback cocktail.
And then of course there's the mint julep.
Love the mint julep. So
we'll leave it on that note. Loves
Okay.
the mint julep. We've been talking with author Albert Schmid and master chef about his Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook. From the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books 2011, I'm Barbara Deeb.